All right. That screen sharing working? Is it visible? Perfect. Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. It's great to have you joining us. It's a little bit earlier in the day here. I know it may be later where a number of you are, but thanks for taking time to zoom in. So I guess we can start with some quick introductions before we hop into some of our content, which is talking a little about the U.S. employment market and making some suggestions on next steps. But if you haven't joined some of the earlier sessions we did, my name is Brooke Meisner. I'm one of the staff in the Career Management Center, where I've been working with a couple of different groups, but have spent some time especially with our international students. And then we also have Emily Anderson from the Career Management Center. Emily, anything you want to add?
No, just welcome and looking forward to meeting you all in person soon.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we've got a fair number of things that we are going to cover today. So I'll kind of give you a quick overview of what we're going to be touching base on. And after that, we throughout, if you have any questions, please feel free to hop in. We'll be watching the chat box some. But we'll also have plenty of time at the end to make sure you all have questions too. So we're going to cover a couple of different things today. If you were able to join us, we did another session on the 20th, March 20th, April 20th. And that session was really speaking with a lot of current international students. We had a few MBAs, one that was graduating, two that are headed into their summer internship. We had an MSF joining us and talking about their experiences. So in my mind, that gave some very practical advice, some real, real tactical things that you could implement. That's posted on International HQ. We'd encourage you to make sure you check out that video and hear from the perspective of those students. So in this session, we're kind of zooming out a little bit. We're giving a much kind of backing up, bigger perspective. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the different ways that international students are able to work in the US. Hopefully you know a little bit about that, but we're going to talk briefly about some of the different visas and benefits of those visas and work authorizations. Emily's going to spend some time looking at the US recruiting landscape and some of the great information that we have around that. Then we're going to hopefully kind of talk about, sort of bridging that gap, how you can use some of this information to find good opportunities and what you can be doing. And we're going to be wrapping up with some helpful resources and then some next steps, thinking about what you should be doing now. And that's one of the big takeaways is hopefully you can turn all this into some very concrete things to be doing over the summer in the next few months before you get to campus. All right. So first off, hopefully you know a little bit about this. One of the things that we really encourage our incoming international students to be very familiar with is some of the different visas and how those work. And I know that for some of you, this may be something you're very familiar with. You may have lived or worked in the US and you may know this way better than you would want to know. And that's great. And you have thoughts and perspectives, please feel free to hop into our conversation on that. Those of you who, especially if this is your first time coming to the US, if you aren't familiar with this, I would really encourage you to get to know more about some of what we're going to be talking about here, because chances are good that you may know or need to know more about this than some of the employers that you're speaking with. So just briefly to run through this, as you're getting started, you'll be on an F1 or a J1 visa. Speaking of, if anybody, typically our students coming in are an F1 visa, but if anybody happens to be on a J1 visa or another visa other than F1, if you don't mind dropping that in the chat box, if you're comfortable sharing that's kind of helpful for us to know. But one of the things we'll be working with is with ISSS is getting all set up on your student visa. So the first benefit to talk a little bit about, a benefit of your those that are going to be an F1 visa will be CPT, which stands for Curricular Practical Training. And it's basically the benefit of your F1 visa, which will allow you to work in the US and do a summer internship. So that's sort of the quick explanation of that. CPT typically at Vanderbilt is something that is reserved for students that are current students. It's typically used before graduation, and then after graduation, you'll see sort of the next character there. After graduation and looking for a full-time role, that's when you'll use OPT or optional practical training. So that's typically for a year after graduation, but it can be extended if you're pursuing a STEM field. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but another reason to be thinking about STEM options. And then eventually, for those that are going to be staying in the US for more than the 1 to 3 years that OPT provides, you'll want to be thinking about an H-1B visa. And for even a lot of students, even as they're thinking about their first job after graduation, hopefully they're working with their employer to be able to use that H-1B visa. So again, we get into a lot more detail about this. We're going to get a little bit in the next slide, but it really encourage you to start being familiar with concepts like which student visa you're going to be on, CPT, OPT, and then H-1B. So to just go in a little bit more depth and get you thinking about this, if you are on an F1 visa, we talked about CPT will be something that you'll be using for your summer internship. For those of you that are an MBA student, it'll probably be especially important to know. It could also be something during the second year of your MBA that you could potentially use to do an in-school internship. So that's really another possibility there. For those on an F1 visa, so probably almost everybody here who's going to be on an F1 visa, you'll be wanting to think about OPT. It's a great benefit. There's no lottery like the H-1B, so it can work, pretty simply, especially compared to things like the H-1B. So something to think about. Since I didn't see in the chat anybody mentioning being on a visa other than the F1 visa, I mentioned the J-1 visa, and there are sort of certain benefits that come with that, specifically the academic training benefits. So that's another possibility there. For the F1 visa, we talked a little bit about the STEM extension and how instead of OPT lasting just for 1 year, it can last for up to 3 years. So we'd really encourage those of you who have the option, we'd encourage you to consider that. So those of you that are in the MSF, that whole degree is STEM certified, so it's pretty straightforward. Just by doing the degree, you have that option, which is a huge help. As long as your work that you're doing after the MSF connects to the degree, you'll be able to leverage that. For those pursuing MBA, there are certain concentrations that are STEM certified. Not all concentrations are, but there are two. One is the operations and analytics concentration, and the second one is the finance concentration. So if you concentrate in one of those areas or in both, and then have work then that aligns with those concentrations, then you'll be able to leverage that. So definitely something to be thinking about, because I mentioned the H-1B visa. And there are a number of students who are going to be who graduate, use OPT and STEM OPT extension, and then continue to pursue the H-1B visa through their employer for sometimes a couple of years, because right now the H-1B lottery has been challenging. So the H-1B lottery and that application process can get into a bit of detail. I will say that during the school year, first off, it's not something you need to spend a lot of time thinking about now, but knowing a little bit can be helpful. During the school year, we typically have some immigration attorneys that do some sessions for us and talk even more about how this works. So we typically do that later on. Like I said, it's because right now the first thing you need to be thinking about is getting internships and jobs. And once you start to get that more in line, then it's good to be thinking more about this. But it's helpful to know a little bit about how the lottery works. So there are 65,000 slots available for those that are applying to the H-1B lottery, and then there's 20,000 additional spots for those that are pursuing master's degrees. So there's another benefit there to your having this advanced degree. As you can see from the numbers there have been a lot of applicants, far more than there are spots, which is where when there are more applicants for the H-1B than there are spots in the lottery, that leads to the drawing, the lottery happening to decide who gets those spots. So you can see it's definitely not a guarantee, not something that you can just assume. And I think one of the main things to be aware of is because the H-1B is a lottery, there's some chance, there's some risk involved. That's one of the reasons that a lot of employers may be thoughtful about hiring candidates that do need to go through that, is they know that, hey, there's a candidate over here who has permanent residency or US citizenship. There's not a risk that they will be chosen or not chosen by the H-1B lottery, but versus other candidates that are pursuing the H-1B, there is that risk that they may need to leave if they don't get a spot. that makes things more challenging. So I think that's just something to be aware of. I wish that weren't the case, but it is, and it's good to be aware of it so we can work with that. All right. That is what I have on that section. Maybe before I pass it over to Emily to talk more about some of the numbers, any questions on any of this that come up? Anybody want to put anything in the chat box briefly, or unmute themselves and ask a question related to that? So Alexander's asking, how soon after we finish our program do we need to find a job? So the short answer with that is it varies a little bit. If you are planning to work in the US, if you're planning to use OPT, you need to find a job. Some of that will depend on when you set your OPT start date. So there's some flexibility as to when you can start OPT. You can apply for OPT without having an offer in hand. So that's one of the big factors. So one of the things you want to think about is where you are in the job search process. You want to work with the ISSS, the International Student Scholar Services Office, to decide when. But I believe it's 60 days after graduation is when you need to start it. So typically sometime in July is when you would need to start your OPT. And then after that, you have 90-day grace period in which you can be unemployed. So if you really kind of stretch everything to the max, you can maybe hit into the early fall. But obviously, sooner the better allows for some more options. So Saugat, you're welcome, Alex. Thought that can help. Saugat is asking, and please correct me if I'm off on pronunciation. Names. Do employers pay for H-1B application for all 3 years if unlucky, or is it just a one-time cost for them? I believe it's a one-time cost. Take that back. It's where they're paying each year that they apply. So each time that they apply to the U.S. government, there is a fee that goes with that. I'd imagine that I know some of it is paperwork that goes into that. So some of it may be a little bit easy to reuse from one year to the next. But some of it isn't. There is an upfront fee that an employer needs to pay to the government for applying for H-1B. Andrea, has there been Vanderbilt alumni that have been successful with the H-1B lottery? Short answer, yes. There definitely have been. There have been some that have not been successful. Certainly those that have been able to, we talked about the 20K additional lottery for those with master's degrees. Those they can tap into that pool as well. So the 85,000 versus just the 65,000. I mean, that can certainly increase your odds some. Having multiple years which to apply for the H-1B lottery, certainly that can help as well. It's also, there are a couple of countries that have specific carve-outs. If anybody here is from Singapore, or I think we had a Santiago, Chile, right?
Chile, yeah.
So there is a carve out for Chile. So Sebastian, you're in a good situation on that front. There are a couple of other unique visas, a couple of I believe it's EE treaty visas. I don't know a lot about that, but the immigration attorneys who come through have helped. There's also the TN visa that works for only specific occupations for those that are from Mexico or from Canada. So there's some other options there, but I'm just talking with one student who's in a very unique, he's on a J1 visa, very unique situation. I don't think there's probably anybody on here who's quite in the same situation he is. And he is considering express entry into Canada. We've had a couple of students who've been able to move right to permanent residency in Canada. It's a little bit simpler in Canada than it is in the US to get permanent residency, a little bit quicker, within about 6 months or less. That can happen. So that's even another possibility. But to my knowledge, I'm only aware of 2 of our alumni in the past 4 or 5 years that have gone that route. So, but it is another option. Good to be aware of those. All right. You're welcome, Andrea. All right. That's hopefully we're good on that, but we can come back to that if there's some other questions. I'm glad that you all are starting to think about these things. Please keep learning, asking, getting different opinions. And then certainly with CPT and OPT, if you're working with Vanderbilt ISSS, they're sort of the expert on campus about that. So I'd really encourage you to be in touch with them about that as well. Well, Emily, I'll turn this over to you to talk a little bit more about where the employment markets are.
Sure. Thanks, Brooke. One thing to add, and Brooke, correct me if I'm wrong, but when we're talking about your strategy and which companies you're looking to begin recruiting with, one thing to consider are large global companies, because we've had examples where students have gone through their period of the employers applying for the H-1B, not getting it in the lottery. So then the students would move to another geography in a different region of the world, either Europe, Asia Pac. And then there's a different set of visas that an employer has access to transfer employees. So instead of applying for H-1B, they would apply for a different set of visas that are transfer visas. So that's been an option that some global employers have utilized to balance out their workforce or their labor pool across a global platform.
I'm glad you brought that up. Absolutely. Yeah, we've definitely had a couple of students that have had that happen. I think, yeah, exactly. If you're working for a large, multinational company, they can do that. They can move you around within the company. So, I mean, I can think of, we've had somebody at Microsoft is one of the first people that comes to mind that had that situation happen, was able to do just what you said, and eventually moved back to the US with Microsoft.
Yeah. So that this is, we wish it was more straightforward. We certainly wish we had an immigration policy that was closer to Canada, which is more of a skill-based immigration policy. Currently, it's not. So, we're trying to help you navigate this in conditions that are not necessarily as optimal as what we would like. So anyway, with all that being said, the reality is our outcomes have been good for international students. So over the last years, I've been here 20 years, and I think every year all students wind up on the MBA side being able to land a summer internship and utilize their CPT, which is a great thing to do because some of you will be doing job transitions. And so the internship is a platform for you to get some work experience, perhaps in an area that you might not currently be coming from, that will help your candidacy for a full-time job. And in many cases, the internship is the doorway into a full-time opportunity. So that's become more, increasingly more prevalent in MBA, especially MBA recruiting, because these two-year MBA programs utilize the summer internship as a launch pad into a full-time opportunity. So that's why we focus a lot of programming on our first-year MBA students. For MS, if there's any MSF students on the call, they have in the past been able to utilize CPT to do some in-school projects and internships. But MSFs are in a slightly different position because the whole degree is STEM certified, which you'll be able to see on the backside how that impacts employment. So because of that, at 3 months post-graduation, routinely 95% plus of MSFs are fully employed. This year, as we approach graduation, we are at 99% for the MSFs being fully employed, with about 18% of the class being international, something like that. Somewhere between 15 and 20% of the class are international students. For the MBAs, because it's a much wider, broader set of outcomes, we still have good employment results for international students. So every year, over 90% of international students are fully employed, and almost all of them are employed by companies in the US. There's a few that return to their home country or go to another geography, but almost all of ours are staying in the US. So yes, the outcomes can be good. I will say the process can be long and exhausting, but generally speaking, the outcomes have been good. So if you want to go to the next slide. So I know most international students are very interested in, applying some strategy to their recruiting post-MBA. and everyone wants to see some data. So here's some data from the last 5 years of employment outcomes with the MBA class. So by industry and by job function. And these are things to think about because there's certain employers in certain industries where they really value the global workforce. And those are areas that are especially important to target as an international student. So you can see technology, financial services, and healthcare for us are industries that do employ more international students from Owen than perhaps some of the others. It tails off after that. And by job function, you can see where finance and operations, the two STEM certified concentration areas, are have healthy employment. Marketing is still does pretty well. And then consulting, general management, human resources as you go further down that chart. And then just so you can see, this is how it compares to US work authorized students. So the yellow or gold bars are non-US work authorized, and the blue bars are US work authorized students from the same time period. So roughly 80+% of the class is US work authorized, and on average, 16% of our class has been non-US work authorized. And so these are results over the last 5 years. So you can see where the technology industry is overemployed on a percentage basis, international students. But in financial services and healthcare, you can see it's relatively close to the same percentage of the seeking student body that is able to secure a position. And then you can see by job function, you can see where finance and certainly operations are performing quite well for international students. Any questions on this? All right, well, we can move on to, I think the next slide may have a little bit of information about MSF. So the MSF degree is much more narrow than the MBA degree, and well over half of our class goes into an analyst role in a financial services organization, primarily in investment banking. And so you can see international students have been able to do quite well as investment banking analysts. Then just our classes are dominated by banking. So you can see international students are performing about at the same rate that domestic students are. Now, one thing that to keep in mind, and these are things that that really, I would say, impact you in the spring, especially around anywhere from January to right about now. So offer rates for international students across the board tend to lag US domestic offer rates because of the situation that Brooke has described, with just the fact that fewer companies are opening applications across the board, across work authorization status. In the end, the international students or students without US work authorizations, generally speaking, are very successful in the job search, but the timing may lag, which does cause some angst. And we definitely saw it again this spring with some international students that were particularly worried because it feels like the whole class is getting their internship in January, which is not necessarily the case, but it does tend to cause some angst. So we do see in the end that international students do land their internships and are able to do a successful summer, but these are things to be aware of. It may not, the rate of offers may be lagging behind US work authorized students. So it happens both for MSF and for MBA. So Brooke, if you have something to add to that.
Yeah, I think another stat we don't have here, but over the years, we've kind of looked at when we have employers posting positions with us. So a lot of you are getting access to the 1220 system. And if you look in the 1220 system, when employers are posting positions, it's roughly about a third of the positions that are posted are open to candidates that would need visa sponsorship, and 2/3 are not. So as you can imagine from that, part of the reason I think we're seeing the lag that we're seeing for international students to find these offers is it just takes longer. Like there are fewer employers out there that are posting positions. And it's definitely a broader macroeconomic issue. Some of it's related to certainly the policies that we're talking about and how the whole machine of immigration works in the US. So some of that is, often I wish it weren't outside of our control, but a lot of it is. But I think one of the things we do try to focus on is what are the things that we can navigate, what are the things we can work with and can control, given that situation. But it's not the best news, but I think it is helpful to know that you'll be getting to the US, and if you're looking for a job here in the US, you'll find a number of opportunities that may be good opportunities, but unfortunately that employer won't always be open to candidates that need visa sponsorship. And there's another conversation there of, are there ever times you can work around that? In short, there can be. I wouldn't base, your whole internship or job search around that. But it is just something to kind of be aware of and to start thinking about now how you kind of work with that and navigate that situation. All right. I'll move on to the next slide.
So just to summarize some of the data is approximately a half of ON International MBA students do gravitate towards jobs in the STEM certified fields, finance and operations. Mainly if staying in the US is your number one priority, we would certainly advocate that you give yourself the most opportunities and the best chance of landing a well-paid MBA level job in those particular fields, because you'll find more opportunities in those areas. By industry, you can see from the data that tech, financial services, and healthcare have been good employers for international students. And, the tech industry, probably the best international employer for MBAs. And no one should discount the Amazon effect across all MBA programs. Amazon has an active recruiting program. They don't hire international students for every single opportunity, but they hire for the majority of the opportunities. So don't discount opportunities with Amazon. They will start presenting information very early in the recruiting process in the early fall. They have their recruiting process is much more geared towards, it's hard to say it's meritocratic, but there's less networking in their process. It's much more application driven. They do have various MBA level programs. We'll be talking more about that. Amazon will be talking more about it, but you can go right now to the Amazon MBA web pages and you can read about the programs. They have a finance program. They have 2 different product manager programs, a technical and a non-technical. They have a retail leadership development program, and then they have the operations pathways program. So these are all really good MBA programs. They train their people well, they pay well. They are a global company. So it's definitely, we're not telling you have to pursue Amazon, but it's definitely worth it because there's been a lot of success with the Amazon recruiting programs. If you're targeting consulting, international students have been successful in consulting, but I tell this to domestic and to international students, always have a multi-pronged approach with consulting. It's a highly sought after field post-MBA. and it does pay very well, but the process for recruiting can be long and torturous because a lot of it is reliant on a case interview. So if you haven't had a lot of experience with case interviewing, we start working on that very soon, and we have an upcoming early session later this month on case interviewing. They also are they're evaluating candidates based on not only their hard tangible abilities, but they also are evaluating you on your client readiness and client acumen. So that's where a lot of the networking comes in meeting and greeting people, because it's definitely a people-oriented business. So just be aware of that. And in the end, it's always good to have a backup plan if you're targeting consulting. Investment banking has been fantastic for our MSF students, and we've definitely had success with MBA students in banking too. Most of the banks are global, which does give you the option if the bank can't secure your H-1B within the first 1 to 3 years, then some have been able to move to London or to Hong Kong or a different global location, and then from there move back maybe. And then based on the data, what you should expect is sometimes things happen right on schedule, but you should be prepared for somewhat of a lag in an offer. So many international students will have offers in the spring versus, January. And from our employment report, these are in the last 3 years. These are some of these are the organizations from Owen that have hired international students. So, there's a large number. We also have other resources we will be getting in front of you that gives you an even broader picture of international hiring. So Brooke will be going over those shortly.
And I'll just mention on this too briefly, if you ever want more detail on this, for the past several years on the back of the employment reports that we've released, we have listed all of the companies that students from that employment report have gone to work in. And we've also used an asterisk to designate the companies which are hiring students that are on a student visa. So that's just, there are lots of resources, but that's one quick place that a lot of incoming students are already familiar with that you can check. All right. Any questions kind of on the numbers side of things and where the markets are before we kind of start moving a little bit into sort of what are some of the challenges and risks and what you can do with some of those? Any questions that are coming up? Feel free to either drop it in the chat box or unmute yourself. And you can keep thinking on it too. A lot of good information, so that if you want us to come back to some of the slides, or if you think of questions on that later, just let us know. But I'll keep moving. So we talked a little bit about this, but these are some of the different challenges that it's good to be expecting. I think everybody in their job search and internship search, they face some challenges. And these are some of the ones that we've seen that are common for international students. So I think one challenge is one we've already talked about. There's a limit to the number of US work visas. Because there's that limit, it provides some risk for employers. And because of that risk for employers, some of them decide that they are not open to, as you will see on a number of postings, you're not open to candidates needing visa sponsorship. Sometimes you'll start an application, and one of the first questions on the application is, will you need US visa sponsorship to hold this role? Will you ever in the future need US visa sponsorship? So it can ask things like that. And sometimes it's not a problem, and sometimes unfortunately companies will make decisions based on that. So I think another factor, a challenge, is that US graduate level business recruiting process, it depends on more than just the strength of your application. So actually, maybe something I'll do is to reflect on this a little bit before I dig in this a little bit more, if you all don't mind, in the chat box, when you think about those of you that have conducted job searches previously outside the US, if you've done a job search outside the US, what do you think are some of the key factors? I mean, and the reasons that you were selected as the candidate for that role. What are some of the key factors in that? So if you don't mind, in the chat box, I'd be interested to hear what you think. I've heard, especially from some of our students in India, that if you have really good grades and you're going to a top school in India, that a lot of times that really increases your chance of getting a good job. But yeah, anybody in the chat box, if you have a sense, or if you've been told, hey, in this country outside the US, this is the most important factor for getting a job, please drop that in the chat box. I'm curious to hear what you think, or what you've been told. Any ideas on that? Cultural fit. Amrita says cultural fit was important. Okay, yeah. And Amrita, if you want to expand on that at all, whether what that means or how you think that may have been evaluated. Previous relevant experience, Pollock. Michelle, grades and previous experience. Alex, in Switzerland, it's important to have multiple years of experience to get into banking. Yep. Great. That's definitely helpful.
I think for what we see typically with our international students is you do come into the program with significant experience and great transferable skills. So one of the things that will be trying to help you with is you being able to highlight all of that experience in a way that really resonates with the employers, and really being able to highlight your skill sets as well. So that's good to see.
Thank you all for things that you're adding there. It's really helpful to get some ideas of how that fits. I mean, I'd say as I reflect on what you all have shared, I'd say there's probably some of that is pretty relevant for graduate level roles, MSF, MBA, MArch level roles, and some of it may be a little bit less relevant. Some of it depends on the degree you're in, some of it depends on the roles that you're pursuing. But I will say, I feel like one of our consistent things that we hear from international students is that grades and test scores are not as important. They're significant, and especially if you're pursuing roles like investment banking and consulting, grades can be more and test scores can be more significant. But overall, those things are not the central aspect. That it can be a little bit more around things like, especially in roles like consulting and investment banking, it can be more around things like fit and networking, building relationships with those in the organization. So anyways, I'll continue on, but thank you for the input on that. So the third challenge is, was mentioning networking. Building a professional network will be necessary, just as I mentioned, for especially areas of business where your business is based on developing relationships with other people and helping to bring business into the organization. So we talk about client-facing roles a lot. So those, it can be especially important. I think another thing that's also important is interviewing can look a little bit different in the US. In the US, there's a lot of behavioral interview questions. If you're not familiar with the behavioral interview questions, it often starts with the phrase, tell me about a time when, or describe a situation in which. So an example would be, tell me about a time when you were part of a team and your team faced a challenge, and how did you help resolve that challenge? That would be an example. You may have experienced those questions before, but no matter what area you're looking at, MSF, MBA, or MArch, no matter what function or what industry, you'll experience some behavioral questions. So it's a good thing to get ready for those. And sometimes, even with some of our students that pursue very technical things, the input that we've gotten is, we need you all to be able to do well on behavioral questions as well as the technical questions. So just a couple of things to talk about. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to navigate some of these challenges to expect. So this is just some quick input. One is start early. I mean, part of the reason that we're doing this now is we want to get you all thinking about some of these things early on and working towards some of these things. We're also going to be doing a lot of different events over the summer. We're going to talk about some of the summer sessions in a little bit. So encouraging you to participate in those. Knowing that international students have a smaller number of opportunities to apply for, I would really encourage you all to err on the side of being prepared, being even more prepared than some of your classmates that are not international students. Understanding CPT, OPT, STEM benefits is important, as we talked a little bit about that already. And being able to tell your story, being able to talk about, we talked about behavioral interviewing. Think about the transferable skills you have, the experiences you have that are relevant for the employers and the roles you're pursuing, and being able to talk about those things in a way that's really meaningful for somebody else. So the third step we mentioned here is this being adaptable and formulating a multi-pronged plan. I was on a conversation recently with folks that work with international students in a couple of different schools, and I had this debate about how important it is for international students to have a backup plan. And partway through the discussion, somebody's like, wait, backup plan is not a good word for that, because backup plan means you try your first plan, and if that doesn't work, then you switch to another plan. And that typically does not work. Those of you, for example, who might pursue areas in financial services know that a lot of financial services recruiting in Europe or in Asia Pacific can actually start earlier for those locations than it can for US locations. So I encourage you to all have a multi-pronged plan where you're not just pursuing one route, and then if that doesn't work out, then you adapt, but having sort of simultaneous tracks that you're pursuing. Could be different countries, could be different industries or different roles, but having a couple of different things that you're pursuing. Probably some you're focusing on more than others, but thinking about that. And then I think that last one, really, when I think about some of the students that I've seen be the most successful at this point of connecting regularly with their classmates at CMC, checking in, talking with others, evaluating your progress, getting input from what others are doing, seeing what's working for you, what's not working for you, getting some outside perspective. Was something that we often do internship and job search groups through our office for students. And that's a great way to do that, because you have a chance to meet with other students and hear from what they're saying. And there's also CMC staff that facilitate to help give input as well. So this is a slide we use a fair bit, just talking about the ways that that our office, the Career Management Center, works with students. So these are a number of things that we help with. There are other things that we help with that kind of dig into this, but just keep in mind the different ways that we support students. So let's talk a little bit more in the weeds. If you haven't already had access to the 1220 recruiting platform, I'd really encourage you all to start getting into the system. If you look on the left-hand side, you'll see some of the different things that you're able to do through the system. I will say at present, you're not going to have access to all of those things. For example, the OCI and job listings, you'll have access to that closer to the start of classes. Same with some of the employer and contacts information. But there's a lot of great information you can use. Two things that really suggest is the resource library. There's a ton of great, everything from sample resumes to a lot of in-depth data along the lines of which Emily was sharing some of. So many great tools are in that resource library. So I encourage you to use that, as well as the research tools, especially if you're wanting information about salaries, if you're wanting information about how people find roles with different industries and types of companies. If you're wanting information about interview questions that are asked by certain companies, you can find a lot of that information there. So this is a really great tool. You're going to be using it a lot throughout the year, especially MBAs. So I encourage you to spend time getting familiar with it now, so it's not competing with classes and other things in a bit once you get started with all of that. Hopefully you all are familiar with the International HQ site. Once you're deposited, you get access to this, as well as the OWIN incoming student information page through Brightspace. I'm going to touch on just a couple of different things that you can see there. So one of the things is there's an area about internship and job search, and you can see some of the information here. And basically we go into a little bit more depth on some of the very topics that we've addressed today. You can see advice from alumni. If you want to try to find companies that have a history of sponsoring, we've got a page that deals just with that and gives you several links to look into. a lot of great things I'd suggest you take a look at. So really part of the reasons that we've created International HQ is to try to be that hub, that one place, if you're an international student, you can start. Some of it is related to things that are on the job search, but some of it's related to what are some things you should do before you get to campus pre-arrival. And you can see here, so if you haven't visited this module, International HQ, there's a quick survey. We would gather some information from you. We give you some tips about arriving from some of our second-year MBAs. There's a checklist of things that we suggest that are related to those that are seeking jobs or internships. We ask you to upload a photo of yourself, and if you check out several of those things, you'll get access to a housing document. You can get that a couple of different ways, but check that out and you'll get a copy of a housing document that will help you a list of compiled information from current students about great places that you can stay and that Owen students have stayed around campus. I know some people love reading. These are two books that I have suggested the past couple of years for incoming international students. The 2-Hour Job Search is a book that really breaks down a great way of how to do a job search. The author is someone who does career services at Duke Fuqua, and he's an engineer, and he really kind of applies an engineering mindset to break down the steps to a job search. If any of you are wondering, like we're tossing around this term networking, and if any of you are like, okay, what does that actually tangibly look like? If you read that book, especially if you get into his sort of 3 steps, creating a company list, identifying contacts at the company list, and then reaching out and having informational interviews, especially that second and third step, he really gets into the nuts and bolts of what it is to do interviewing and do it well. The International Advantage is another book. There's one of my favorite parts of that book is there's a part where it talks about how you as an international student can leverage the resources in your university, the international students office, the career management, all of that. So there's a lot of good information in there that you can check out as well. All right, so in wrapping up, I want to touch on a couple of things that I really encourage you all to start working on now and work on this over the summer, May, June, July. The more progress you can make on this, we already talked about basically. Wish it weren't the case, but it is the case that international students have fewer opportunities to pursue, and it often takes them a little bit longer to find opportunities. So you are not all starting on a level playing field with domestic students. I wish that weren't the case, but it is what it is. If you can do these things, it will help to level the playing field some. So that's why we're sharing this with you specifically at this point. The more you can do this now, the more that you're going to be able to be really competitive for a lot of great roles. So this is sort of a summary of a lot of things that we're going to hit on, but basically you can see the different categories that I've mentioned on the left: resources, resume, LinkedIn, networking, and interviewing. So with resources, mention 1220, please spend time on that. I can't emphasize that enough. It's a great tool. There's so much good information there. I was just talking with some students international students who've done really well in their internship search, landed great opportunities. And I was talking about resources in 1220 resource library, and they're like, wait, that's in there? You can find data on all international students who've received jobs for the past 5+ years. that's available there. And I was like, yes, it is. I can show you. So everybody who has access to 1220, which is typically just a little bit of time after you've deposited, you can view that and a lot more. If you're in a pre-3, I know if you're an MSF working on the pre-3, please be spending a lot of time on that. The more progress you can make over the summer, the better chances you'll have to have good tools to be able to find a summer internship if you're seeking one or don't have one, as well as to find a full-time opportunity. I know Jenny just sent an email to you all yesterday about that. So please dig into pre-3. It goes into a lot of the things we described here in greater depth. And lastly, I've mentioned the International HQ site, so please check that out. For resumes, over the summer, I really encourage you all to develop an Owen format resume and start tailoring it to the target companies and employers that you want to pursue. And after you've done that, to meet with CMC staff over the summer. Probably it will be a virtual meeting, but meet with them and have them go through that. It looks a little bit different for different programs, but if you're watching our emails, if you're checking in 1220, you can see how to do that. So that's something I'd encourage you all to be thinking about. If you're not familiar with LinkedIn, LinkedIn is basically social media for the internship and job search. I was just talking with one of our data science students who had a great story of getting reached out to from an employer through LinkedIn. She interviewed for a role. They said no to her, even though she made it to the final rounds. And then they reached out a few weeks later and said, you know what, we found another role that we think you might even be a better fit for. And she just got that offer just earlier this week. So a lot of that for her happened right through LinkedIn. So LinkedIn's a great resource, basically kind of a way to make your resume very publicly available and to start seeing what employers are posting. Networking, we talked a little bit about that, but start building relationships. Start building relationships now with your classmates, your incoming classmates. Start building relationships with the students that are currently in the MBA or MSF or MARC program. Start building relationships with the people that you know, especially people who are working in your organization in roles that you might be interested in, just to learn more about what those roles are like. A lot of those relationships will be helpful for you, not just now, but later in your internship and job search. And lastly, we talked about interviewing, working especially on behavioral interviewing for everybody. If you're pursuing finance roles, you're wanting to be working on your technical interviewing using things like Training the Street. If you're doing consulting, you want to work on your case interview preparation. A lot of great resources that we'll be talking about some more in just a moment. So to kind of tie in some of what I showed on the last slide, these are some events that are coming up. So these are all posted on 1220 under events. So I'd encourage you all to be checking that resource. I know we'll be adding a couple more additional events. So keep an eye on that because there'll be more updates, but hopefully this can give you an idea of where to start with things. So let's run through some of these real quickly. If you're pursuing case interviewing, definitely want to take advantage coming up just next week, the Management Consulted event. They're going to do a follow-up event even after that, but there's the first one for those of you who are thinking about that. And I'll also say those of you who are pursuing things, especially MBAs pursuing things or MSFs, corporate finance, corporate strategy, it can be really helpful to know some case interviewing. So, so I'd encourage you all to check that resource out as well. Mention those of you that are doing financial services, especially in investment banking type roles. Engage in Training the Street. You're going to be getting a lot more information on that soon, but that's a great resource. If you're not familiar with Training the Street, they do training at a lot of the major banks. So there's a lot there. We talked about behavioral interviewing. We have a great online system that you can use for that. It tells you about things like, if you're not familiar with the STAR-R format, situation, task, action, result format, and leading a lot of your responses with the result and then coming back to it. That's a really important thing to be thinking about. So yeah, some more to follow on that. This is targeting our MBA students, but it's open to other students. Starting on the 14th of June, and pretty much every Tuesday around, I think it's around noon thereafter, we're doing career path overviews with different functions. The first one's on consulting. I believe the second one's on investment banking, finance. But every Tuesday, you can tune into those. We talked about how important LinkedIn is. We have two of the folks that worked for LinkedIn for a number of years that are doing some presentations for us. They're doing one in June about LinkedIn for career exploration. So especially if you're exploring different career options, you may want to think about that. Skipping to August, on August 2nd, we're doing a session around the diversity conferences and national career fairs. If you are an MBA student, I would really encourage you. If you listen to the session we did on April 20th, some of the first year students were basically like, one of them is of the persuasion it should be mandatory. All international students, if you're an MBA, should go to one of those conferences because it really can be helpful. And it's really a way to jumpstart your recruiting. And so there's a session to learn more about those. Also, a lot of over the summer, early bird registration for a lot of those conferences like National Black, Prospanica, Ramba conferences, those are all happening. So once classes start, things start happening really quickly in terms of career management. There's the internship fair where all of the second year MBAs will come back and share about their summer internship experiences. You can see on the 26th, the LinkedIn guys are going to come back. They're going to do a session that's just focused on international students and talk about networking. I've seen them do other presentations and they're great. I'm really excited to hear them do that one. If you're interested in tech, we talked about how tech is an area that is an area employers are very open to international candidates needing visa sponsorship. Lewis Lin has several books on the topic of pursuing roles in product management in tech. So you can see that. And then you can see September 6th is when employers start visiting campus for recruiting purposes. And it's basically a steady, slow ramp up after that. So there's a lot going on. So part of the reason we encourage you all to start digging in now. All right, that is what we have. And what questions do you all have? Is there anything that we all can help with? I know we're out of time, so I know some people may need to head out. Certainly, please feel free to do that. I'll stop the screen sharing. But if you have any questions, what can we help with? Feel free to either unmute yourself or put something in the chat box. Let's see, any pre-reading suggestions for corporate finance careers? Emily, do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't know about any specific pre-reading, but what I would say, this is, we'll start talking about getting a target list of companies, and usually on the company website, there, say, for example, Microsoft Finance or, different companies you might be interested in. If you go to their websites, they usually have some, they'll have a sample job description, which will be good to look at, and we'll have some additional resources. So corporate finance is a pretty broad career area in the sense of it could be internal facing or external facing. So for example, on internal facing, it could be much more around planning and forecasting, budgeting, decision support, or it could be external facing where you're working in a group where perhaps a corporate development group where you're working with banks from the internal side, or in treasury where it's cash management. So I think a good place to start is perhaps even if you have an industry you're thinking about right now, you may not have completely decided on it, but think of some of the larger companies, Google their websites, and on finance, MBA finance, and you'll find some pretty good information just to kind of round out. The other thing you'll also have access, and we didn't talk about this as much, but with your VUNet ID, you will have access to our Walker Management Library data or resources. And one of the databases that is commonly used for career exploration information is Vault. And so when you go to the Walker Management Library website, you can go to the Vault database, and there will be some good information based on different career paths you might be interested in. There's a question about accessing Training the Street. So Training the Street has a series of online modules, and we are planning on bringing them on campus in the fall as well. But a good way to get started are with these online modules. So Brooke and Jenny and I are working with Training the Street to get the modules set up, and you will receive a link. They'll be posted in our resource library in 1220, and you'll get some correspondence about how to access them. But you'll have a link, and you'll be able to register and access their courses. Brooke, are we targeting a particular date for access to start, or I can't remember now what we came up with?
I think our hope was by, I think, sometime next week to get it done. This is commencement week around Vanderbilt, so it's a fun time of year. But I know Jenny was actually just emailing with Training the Street, and I think she's getting it set up. So it'll probably be set up, by next week, and there'll probably be an announcement soon thereafter. And Emily, following up on what you're saying, your last point, really good point that you brought up about resources from the Walker Management Library. I'm sharing a link, and they have a lot of research guides. Some of the tools you'll have to use your VUNet ID to access. But if you follow some of the links on that, that'll take you to the Vault Guide and a number of other resources, which can be great. If you want to learn a little bit more about, corporate finance, use that to research a couple of different industries and companies that you're thinking about. Seeing a question.
Michelle had a question about how early they should be applying. So in the cycle of U.S. recruiting right now, these companies are they're at the end of their cycle, so they're securing full-time opportunities or full-time students and internships. So for the most part, applications have not been opened up for internships or for full-time jobs yet, and they won't necessarily be opened up until it depends, but probably in the early fall for some, and for others, applications won't open till late fall or early winter for internships.
There was a question that came through around on the list of employers shown in the previous slides, are some of those outside the US offices? And I will say, yes, there are some. It's not a large number, especially we've had in the past couple of years, some students from Japan, not just Japan, but that stands out especially, where we've had students that have worked for places like Johnson & Johnson. They have an international leadership development program. We've had some students work with Amazon. We've had students work with Eli Lilly. I think we've got a student that's graduating who's in Ryo, who is in the panel that we did on the 20th. He's headed to Eli Lilly, Japan. So those are examples of a couple of others. And there are a number of companies that do a lot of recruiting for roles outside the US and have posted those through 1220. So it's a good thing to keep an eye on.
One of the things to expect too is when companies do presentations for students, which those will start in September, and they'll have company representatives, alumni, various people to talk about opportunities at the company. And in many times they will go over how to apply in multiple regions. So US or North America versus Asia Pac versus Europe. If they don't go over that, it's always appropriate to ask what the timing of and when, what the opportunities are outside the US. But generally speaking, the recruiters for the companies will be able to address applications across the globe, not just in the US or North America.
There's also, I posted the link to the Vault Guides, and there are a few Vault Guides that are very specific to doing an internship or job search outside the US. I think there's one that's like, pursuing financial service roles in Asia Pacific. And there's another one that's, it's consulting in Europe. So those could also be another good resource for that.
And these are, as Brooke mentioned earlier, when we talked about having multiple plans, those are parallel routes. You might be very specific about what type of job you want or what industry you want, but you could pursue multiple geographies. And that's definitely something that we would encourage just because of different work visa restrictions in different geographies. So it enhances your chances of success, especially if you're very specific of, for example, I want to be a product manager for a technology firm.
Great. Are there any other questions that are coming up? I'll add to Emily's last question or last comment too. There on International HQ, we share some data with a couple of other schools, other top MBA programs in the US. And you can see where students from those programs on an aggregate level, you can see what are some of the employers that they've gone to work in, both in the US, but outside the US as well. If you want to try to get a sense of more broadly, which companies outside the US or in the US are open to candidates on a student visa. All right. Well, I think that's all we have. Kim, is there anything that you want to add?
I don't think so. I think you guys did a fantastic job of covering everything.
Great.
So thank
Well,
you so much for offering this.
Yeah, no, glad to do it. And I'll say, in terms of things that we're doing over the summer that's specific for international students, I know coming up in the month of June, I think June 15th is the date that there's going to be a session that's going to be led by some of the staff from other offices at Owen, I believe, especially Jerry from the Academic and Student Affairs Office, and possibly Emiko from the Leadership Development Program, that they'll be more involved with that as well. So that'll be coming up soon. I'd keep an eye on International HQ as well as 1220 for updates on when those and other events coming up happen.
I
Yeah,
do have something to announce. I just got the news right before this meeting that the ELC, the English Language Center at Vanderbilt, is offering a new English for Business Purposes program, and it's completely online. So you can, it's self-paced online, and you can do that before coming to Owen. So that'll be posted in International HQ.
great. Excellent. Good. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap things up from there. So I hope you all take care. We look forward to being in touch with you over the summer. Thank you for your kind words. A lot of great things in the chat. I appreciate your comments, your engaging, your discussion, working together, and we look forward to working more with you all. So you all can take care, and I think we'll stop the recording and maybe stick around just in case there are any final questions.